Hey, what's up, Internet? Let's talk 3.17 and Siege Ballista Totems. For those of you following my channel, this was my league starter for 3.16, and I really had a good time. Now, compared to Freezing Pulse Totems, if you were with us reading the Balance Manifesto or when we were first checking out the patch notes, basically nothing happened to this build. There were almost zero relevant changes for Siege Ballista compared to Freezing Pulse Totem. This is a good thing considering how disrupted Freezing Pulse is and how much I enjoyed playing this. I think the only two changes to talk about for this build are going to be the fact that the Hiri's Demise, mine is Scourge, you can ignore that, but this was a Fated Prophecy upgrade in 3.16. So you needed the Hiri's Bite Quiver, which is really easy to make. You just crafted it at a vendor, and you had to get a Prophecy to upgrade it. Well, Prophecy is getting deleted in 3.17, and so this quiver is going to just drop as a random drop from map bosses. I don't know what that means for the drop rate of the quiver. It is a pretty important item, but there is an Atlas skill tree node they've already shown that gives you a pretty large increase. I think like 80% increased chance to drop these Fated uniques from the map bosses on top of like a 75% rarity bonus. So maybe it'll be kind of easy to self-farm. That node is really early. It's like one of the earliest nodes you can get to, so that might help. I think the only other real change is that, where is our Awakened, Added Cold, and Added Cold. Both gems got a slight nerf, I think around 1 gem level or less. It doesn't really matter. It's not a significant nerf to this build. You probably won't even notice it compared to, we're going to get a bunch of extra power creep in the fact that we're getting like Eldritch Implicits and other itemization changes that haven't yet been discovered. I wouldn't think about it. It's basically a non-factor. And in general, this build is just really strong in a trade environment. Most of the individual items aren't that expensive, right? Like Astramentis, like most of them are like mid-tier or better uniques that are core to the build. Obviously, Headhunter is not that important. Iron Commander is dirt cheap. Like some of these are mid-tier uniques, I would say, like Hiri's Ire and Garrigan's Flight can sometimes be a little bit tricky to get at League Start for really cheap. I would say one of the biggest downsides when playing like the League Start version of this is that Rain of Splinters is another pretty core unique, just like it has become for Freezing Pulse. And the price of this is probably going to be pretty expensive at League Start because there's a lot of people playing Explosive Arrow Ballista. A lot of content creators are making videos about Explosive Arrow Ballista, and I expect it to be very popular. So the price of this, which basically every totem build wants now, I would expect it to go pretty high. I think when Forbidden Rite totems were really popular in 3.15 it was, in Expedition, I think that jewel was like 45 chaos in the first couple days or something. So that's not too fun. But it's probably the biggest ticket item you might need before wanting to switch over to Siege Ballista. I would say the biggest issue I ran into last league was just trying to figure out an optimal way to level it. I didn't have any experience with Siege Ballista, and I had never really tried to level a Hierophant into like a dex path like that. I wound up doing it with Toxic Rain Ballistas and Toxic Rain and Caustic Arrow, since that was kind of the meta build at the time. And it was like okay. I wasn't impressed compared to how we level with Holy Flame Totem. With all these Explosive Arrow Ballista videos out there, I thought, well, I'll give that a shot. It looks like it has a reasonably similar tree, and I found that it's actually pretty good. Like, it's a pretty good build. I understand why people are trying to League Start it, but it also does make for a pretty convenient leveling path for us. So if we jump over to the path of building, let's talk about how I've changed the path of building and the leveling advice for this guide. Okay, so here we are in the 3.17 version of the PoB. Again, path of building isn't actually updated yet, but it really isn't going to matter for this build because nothing relevant to 3.17 is really going to change for us relative to this path of building. This is sort of a week 1-esque looking setup. Not much has changed here for the standard setup. What has mainly changed is I've added a more complete like leveling guide to the forum thread, where you start as Holy Flame Totem and Purifying Flame, but then in Act 3, right after you do your first lab, you swap over to the Explosive Arrow style of build that a lot of people are like doing guides for and stuff. We just do it with a Hierophant, and I have the act by act trees here to show you, you know, exactly what you need to do. So if you look at we'll look at Act 4 after you swapped over to Explosive Arrow. This section of the tree, like from here up, is what you're gonna have to respec, like mandatory, when you switch over to Siege Ballista. Whenever you do that into maps, right? Because you can easily take Explosive Arrow all the way to maps and beyond. It's a pretty strong build, and it's only getting stronger in next patch. But this chunk is actually a little bit easier to respec than it was with the Holy Flame Totem setup I had, and it's just easier to make the swap from this into Siege Ballista. Because if you look at like Act 10, when you finish, you're already in a much more similar position down here. Now, if we show I've got some like leveling footage when I did my test run as solo self-found on Explosive Arrow Ballista. Just kind of going in blind and following a rough version of like Zizzarin's guide for that. I've made some tweaks to the tree to help you know, facilitate swapping over, so we don't have to do quite as many respecs. But as you can see, it's really smooth by this point, right? And it's actually pretty smooth as soon as you switch. I would say you don't want to switch right when you unlock the library. I think you just want to wait until a little bit longer, do the first lab with Holy Flame Totem and like Purifying Flame or maybe Wave of Conviction, and then just go ahead and switch. But by here, when we're just doing the Act 10 stuff, I'm already just blitzing right through this stuff, and I had no problem cleaning up Kitava and getting into maps with this build. It definitely felt like a smoother and more powerful experience than leveling it with the partial Holy Flame Totem tree, and gives you like more of a head start for getting into like white maps especially. One thing I will say is right when you get to maps, so like this would be your Act 10, like you're just barely getting to maps, or like, you know, around level 70, you're gonna be a little bit squishy to spell damage, because like you're not into Siege Ballista probably if you're league starting. So as you can see, I've taken some early, like, you know, we've taken the spell suppression here. I think my next 2 points beyond level 70, I'd probably start taking like Entrenched and getting some more. Maybe trying to get a Hiri's Ire pretty early, because even with Mage Bane, you're gonna have like 50 to 60% spell suppression. If you can get any early gear pieces that have spell suppression, that really helps. I just find that like right when you get to white maps and you're dealing with your tier 1 to 4s, you've got a, you know, pretty mediocre health pool, maybe like 3,000 to 3,500, and without capped spell suppression, there's some really nasty enemies that'll catch you off guard sometimes, like the water elementals that kind of look like watery women, but they have like an unavoidable water attack that hits you from the top. It's a pretty obnoxious enemy actually, but in maps they sometimes spawn in packs, because like you'll get a rare one and then it has like 8 more, you know, with it, and they just all instant cast, and it's not an avoidable attack, so that can cause a lot of spike damage. So shoring up your spell suppression is basically fixing what I would say is your biggest threat when you first get to white maps, and then you can just focus on map progression and getting some currency to get your early pieces for your Siege Ballista swap, which you can do as early as like just getting to maps. Like this setup for Siege Ballista is more than enough to just go running headlong into maps. And as you can see, it's basically, like I said, just cutting off everything above Retribution. It's ideal if you can afford the extra respec to come out this way and then drop Retribution 2 in these elemental nodes to get further down here. But this respec up here costs like 22 points, I want to say. to go from this to this, which is basically exactly as much as all the quests give you in the story. I think you get 20 out of the story, so you need like 2 regret orbs to do that. So you can do that really fast. Now, if you've never played Siege Ballista, once you are in the, the actual Siege Ballista tree, it plays, I would say, a fair bit like Freezing Pulse, in that map clearing is pretty much just drop and go totems. It definitely has the ballista slant to it, where you're dropping ballistas at your feet and not out in front of you. So if like you just look at this clear example from my Scourge character, just doing like a random tier 16, the projectiles are getting out in front of you, because once they start firing, the projectiles, they go pretty far, but it's not quite as safe, I would say, as Freezing Pulse in terms of playstyle, right? Because you're not getting those totems way out in front of you, so like they're taunting way out in front of you or shooting their projectiles way further ahead. You're kind of just like dropping them every few feet. The incredibly fast totem placement speed makes this still feel pretty smooth, and your shots are all primarily cold damage, and they have a high crit chance, so you do a lot of chilling and freezing, just like with Freezing Pulse. The advantage of this build, I would say, compared to a build like Freezing Pulse, I would say it's twofold. Number one, if we look at just single target damage, something like Shaper, this build scales its single target much easier than something like Freezing Pulse. Everywhere from just getting to maps, especially into endgame. The Barrage support gem is a huge deal, and because of the nature of deck stacking, the build sort of just multiplies its damage more naturally than something like a Spell Totem build does. So in the clip here, I've probably got like 35 million, 40 million, something like that, and it's nowhere close to being min-maxed. Like, it's a very good build at this level of gear, but we're talking, and I've seen people with 80 plus million easily. Very, very costly setups, but that's what I mean about the build being kind of really rewarding in trade, because there always seems to be like satisfying upgrades. That is Siege Ballista in 3.17. We've got an entirely new leveling guide to get you into maps and over to Siege Ballista. What looks to be much more satisfying. You guys can give me feedback on that. You can follow the leveling guide in the forum thread and let me know how it works for you. I had a pretty easy time following it myself, and I had never done it before, leveling that way. So hopefully it works out for you. I feel really confident recommending this build after sort of tinkering with the leveling guide like that. There are some caveats, I will say. When you're leveling with Explosive Arrow, there's like a few things you should know. So I've swapped over to my leveling character. This was the one I did the run on a couple days ago to learn how to do this, and I swapped over just to show you a couple things about how to level this character and some things you need to know that if you get wrong can really hurt your DPS. The first is that you want a really high attack speed weapon. So ideally you get a Grove Bow or a Short Bow, any of the bow bases that have 1.5 base attack speed. I think it's like Short Bow, Thicket Bow, and Grove Bow. The base damage of these doesn't really matter. We're only concerned with the fact that it has really fast attack speed. We get an attack speed roll on it on top of that. The attack speed local roll is really important because that modifies the base attack speed. So any other attack speed modifiers we have are more effective when the base attack speed is higher. Secondly, we also want to make sure we don't have any added fire. So if we look at our tooltip, the only line on here that should say added fire is that 1/3 from the top that says explosion will have added fire damage. And the reason we don't want any added fire damage is because of elemental equilibrium. So the way this works is that whenever you hit an enemy, it's going to apply exposure for any element that the hit didn't do. So if my bow was doing pure cold, then the hits would apply lightning and fire exposure. So we do want some source of either cold or lightning, or both. It doesn't matter. So the quiver here would take care of that for me. But we can't have any added fire, or else the arrow is not going to apply fire exposure. The exposure only comes from your ballistas. We're going to be taking Ancestral Bond until we switch over to Siege Ballista. So you can't proc this with your own Frenzy. You're just not doing any damage. But your ballistas will proc it. So now when the explosion goes off, that will eat the fire exposure. But all these ballistas are going to shoot so many arrows that they'll replace the fire exposure immediately. So that doesn't matter. The third thing you want to make sure of is that you don't have any pierce. So the biggest trap that you'll find while leveling is some of the quivers have this as an implicit modifier. So if you look at the very top, sometimes there's some arrow or some quiver bases that have arrow pierces an additional target. These will actually murder your single target, because when when your ballistas are firing, the arrows won't actually stick a fuse, right? They will travel through the guy and stick a fuse in the wall or whatever's standing behind them. So when you just have one target like a boss, they'll just all go right through him and stick a fuse into the wall, which is not what you want to happen, obviously. So no pierce whatsoever. Don't run a pierce gem. Make sure your quiver doesn't have pierce, and make sure it's not on your bow somehow. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. You're going to gear pretty standard. You just want life and mana resistances for the campaign. Attack speed where you can get it is nice, like on gloves or on your quiver. You really, really want a very fast bow. Even if you have to get a low level bow, it doesn't really matter. Like I said, the base damage of the bow is not super important because we're kind of being carried by the explosion damage, which is baked into the skill gem. We're not like scaling the explosion damage with our bow somehow. We can add this elemental damage and stuff, but it's just going to add it to the base arrow hits, and so much of the damage is coming from the explosion. I will say also, we're taking some multiplier nodes here, and like the fire damage over time multiplier mastery. That's because in the next patch, the explosive arrow explosions, when they ignite stuff, there's a multiplier for every fuse, right, that is on the target before it explodes. That multiplier, that 5% more damage with hits, is also going to apply to ailments, to the ignite. So it's going to be a bunch of basically free damage compared to when I leveled this character the other day. And the thing is, you kind of want to get as much ignite chance as you can get, which is why I've got you take the 20% chance to ignite path, and we get another like 10 or 12% here. Yeah, 10%. If you can get more ignite chance anywhere else, like if you get a 5 link, you probably want to add combustion to your explosive arrow for an additional big chance to ignite. And then flammability, which will be on your frenzy with hex touch, also gives another 25% chance to ignite. So that you'll have a high chance against bosses, but if you could get a 5 link, like you get into maps and you're still farming for stuff, then combustion is a pretty nice choice. So yeah, I think that about covers it for Siege Ballista. The build hasn't changed very much other than how we're going to level it, and it totally stomped everything in the Scourge League for me, and I'm pretty confident that it'll do the same in 3.17. If you try this build out and you use the leveling guide in the forum thread, I'm probably going to move that leveling section into the path of building too, by the way. I haven't had time to do that, but hopefully by the time you find this video, that'll already be in the path of building notes section. But if you try it, please give me some feedback on how the leveling and early mapping experience goes for you. As for me, I might play a Siege Ballista character like mid-league, but I'll be starting with Freezing Pulse Totems. But if you have any questions about the build after league start, you run into any issues, you can find me I'll be streaming at League Start over on Twitch at twitch.tv/WallickTV. And you can always jump into the forum thread too if you've got any questions, or jump into the Discord. So there's plenty of ways to seek advice if you need it. Anyway, I will see you guys on League Start. It is 4 in the morning, and I still have to edit and export this video, so I will see you guys tomorrow for League Start. Peace.